Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for April 26, 2024. It's Friday, so I have some questions, and I'm going to start with a couple of you who wrote in and asked what will be the effect of the additional $61 billion the Congress voted up to arm Ukraine and to continue the war against Russia, the proxy war in Ukraine. Now, let me start by reporting the reaction of the Ukrainian government, as expressed by Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. He was quoted in The Guardian as being very critical of the United States. He said, basically, thank you for the money, but $61 billion is not enough. And he compared what he called the single package voted up by the Congress to the build-up in depth going on in Russia. And the quote is, "When I see what Russia achieved in building up its defense industrial base in 2 years of the war, and what the West has achieved, I think something is wrong on the part of the West. The West has to realize that the era of peace in Europe is over," unquote. Now, for a change, I agree with Kuleba on something. The West there's something definitely wrong on the part of the West. But that goes back to the decision that was made to carry out a coup in Ukraine, which put the Kuleba grouping in power, the decision in the West to extend NATO into Ukraine and eastward against Russia, and the decision to, after the coup, to fake support for the Minsk Accord of having agreement to end the shelling and killing in the eastern Ukraine conducted by Ukrainian military, and instead to provoke a Russian special military operation. There is something wrong in the West. The idea that somehow the deployment of military forces to Ukraine or in Ukraine, the shipment of weapons, the sanctions against Russia, that this will somehow weaken Russia to allow the West to essentially loot Russia of its raw materials. That's what's wrong, that kind of thinking, and the unwillingness to negotiate for a peace settlement. Now, saying 61 billion is not enough, more weapons are going in. They may have been going in even while there was no money for them. However, the point is that the weapons alone can't win a war. Now, they are trying to get the money from the $300 billion of Russian assets that were seized by the United States and European banks. But even if they get that, the bigger problem is the lack of soldiers in Ukraine, the unwillingness of some in the Ukrainian population to fight. Now, all of that is denied by Kuleba and by the Ukrainians. And then you come up with a question of, do they want American boots on the ground? And this was asked by a couple of people. Well, Macron is talking about French boots on the ground, but I don't think people take Macron seriously other than as a provocation. But NATO officials are seriously considering what they can do to send troops. Now, will the U.S. do that? Well, Biden, of course, has been unwilling to even consider it. Why is that? Because he faces an election. On the one hand, Biden has promised a victory, which he cannot deliver. On the other hand, he knows the American people are getting fed up with billions of dollars going to Ukraine, while the U.S. has no money for education, infrastructure, and so on. So Biden is in a trap of his own making, as is the West as a whole. You know, this pathetic little unelected prime minister of the United Kingdom, Sunak, is talking about continuing the military aid, upgrading the British Defense Forces, and so on, while the lines keep growing at the National Health Service hospitals. So the whole idea of a Western mobilization to weaken Russia has been exposed on the battlefields of Ukraine. It's not the fault of the Ukrainian soldiers, except to the extent they tolerate a government which is sending so many of them to their deaths with no visible end in sight. and a refusal to negotiate. So in that sense, Kuleba is right. There's something wrong with the West, but there's something wrong with him and his thinking as well. Now, the second question was about the mass graves that have been uncovered in Gaza, especially around two hospitals, the Al-Shifa Hospital and the Nasser Hospital. And there are hundreds of bodies in mass graves. And people are asking, will this cause a response from the West? Well, the South African Foreign Ministry has demanded a thorough and impartial investigation to see what happened here. And it's clear that every day that goes by, they're finding more people, more bodies in these graves. Of course, no one knows for sure how many bodies there are under the rubble in Gaza. With the indiscriminate bombing, with the lack of safe places for civilians, there are many thousands of people missing in addition to the 35,000 that have already been declared dead as a result of the invasion. But what's the State Department? What does the U.S. have to say about this? Typical double talk. Vedant Patel, the State Department briefer, said that these reports of mass graves are, quote, incredibly troubling, unquote. Conjuring up images of Blinken talking about how heartbreaking it is to see all these dead people and all of these unnecessary civilian deaths. But continue to send the weapons, continue to provide political cover for Israel. So Patel, when he was asked, what is the U.S. government going to do about this troubling situation? He said, well, we're asking the government of Israel for more details. Well, then he was asked, does that mean the U.S. will support the demand for an independent investigation? And he said, no, the government of Israel, we're waiting to hear from the government of Israel. Well, you think the government of Israel is going to say, yes, we're committing genocide, we're killing mass numbers of civilians? Then this also brings up the image of John Kirby, the king of double talk from the Biden administration. And that's saying a lot when he said, we have no evidence of genocide or mass killings. So the question then is, how much of this can the West stomach? At what point do the people say, this is too much, it's not acceptable, there has to be a negotiation, there has to be a peace settlement of some sort? The talks continue for a ceasefire, but it appears as though the West is giving Netanyahu the green light to allow another attack on Rafah. And how many civilians will die in that? Well, it's unclear. But to trust the Israelis to have a humanitarian response in an invasion is going over the edge of sanity. Now, these reports, in addition to the overall ongoing reporting from relief agencies of the hunger and starvation of the people who have been denied food and all other kinds of material comforts, this is provoking outrage. And so I have two questions from people on the student demonstrations that are sweeping the country. They ask, will this make a difference? Does anyone care what students think? Well, obviously, the Warhawks care. They sent Mike Johnson to Columbia University to provoke the student demonstrators there. I mean, how stupid is it to send the Speaker of the House, who just presided over a session in voting up another $95 billion for killing, to send him there to deliver a message to the students? And what did Johnson say? He demanded that, he said he's going to call on Biden to order out the National Guard to suppress the protests at Columbia University. We have a number of the Warhawks out with this same line. They're demanding suppression, silencing the critics of genocide. So it's okay to commit genocide, but not okay to protest it? You can't even bring it up as an issue? And of course, young people tend to be the ones who will respond first because they're not so concerned at that point in their lives about the reaction to it. And so often the canary in the mine are the young people. going back to Vietnam and the demonstrations there. I was a young man during the Vietnam War. That was my first experience in politics, and I was appalled by the absolute corruption and the double talk coming from the administration. And fortunately, I found Lyndon LaRouche during that period, who essentially said, don't just respond to the oppression. Look behind it. Why is it happening? Who's doing it? And how can they be defeated? And I would say the same thing should be true for the students. Go out and protest. That's totally legitimate. But make sure you have a plan. And that's why what we're doing with the Oasis Plan is so important. Instead of simply demanding ceasefire now, which in itself is legitimate, demand the Oasis Plan now, a strategy for mutual benefit for Israel and the Palestinians. And this is the only way to end this fighting. Now, in addition to what Johnson called for, you have Governor Abbott of Texas. There are demonstrations at the University of Texas in Austin. And Abbott denounced them as, quote, hate-filled anti-Semitic protests, even though there were many, many Jewish students who were among the protesters. And he tweeted that participants in these demonstrations should be expelled from school and they belong in jail, unquote. So you're going to jail protesters, you're going to silence free speech. And this, of course, calls to mind what Mike Johnson did last week, where the bill to reauthorize the FISA courts there was an attempt to amend it to say that there could be no warrantless wiretaps used to spy on Americans. The vote in the Congress was 212 to 212. Now, how you can find 212 congressmen who would support warrantless wiretaps to spy on Americans is an interesting question. And many, many of those were Democrats who in the past were always opposed to the extension of police state measures. But what's the result of this? Johnson was the one who broke the tie to defeat the amendment. So for 2 more years that FISA was reauthorized by this vote, they can continue to do wiretaps without warrants. Now, interesting, this was something that provoked Donald Trump, who initially said, kill the bill. Why? Because his campaign in 2016 was targeted with warrantless wiretaps. The whole Russiagate investigation, from corrupt networks in the FBI, the CIA, the Obama administration, Brennan, and so on. They were targeting Trump on Russiagate and doing some spying on people like Carter Page and others. So how do people who are supporters of Trump, like Mike Johnson, vote to continue a policy, a program, which has been universally proven to have been illegally involved in the attacks on Donald Trump around Russiagate? And that's where you see the problem with the Republican Party. Where are the principles? And it's not just the Republican Party. Both parties are controlled by the donor class who benefit from war, who just got a $95 billion donation of your tax dollars to continue the war production. And that's the policy which these students are protesting, and the policy of apartheid in Israel and the oppression of the Palestinian people. So I would say to them, more power to you. Keep these protests going. But make sure that your goal is commensurate to the task. And what that means is fight for the 2-state solution with an economic development perspective, which will guarantee benefits to both parties. That's the only way to ensure peace. Now, I'll be attaching in the description section today the interview I did with Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday. I encourage you to listen to it, share it, get it around, and take to heart what she's saying. Now is the time for honest deliberation, thoughtful discussion, and action to take power out of the hands of the war hawks who just were given an almost $100 billion gift by the corrupt U.S. Congress. So thanks for joining me this week. I'll see you again next week.